Good morning, everybody, and welcome. And to those online, welcome to our seminar. It's our first seminar of the year, I do believe. And it's a very, very special seminar today, as we all know. It's a seminar that's going to be given by Professor Clasquin-Johnson, a dear, dear colleague of ours. And it'll also be a farewell event, as he's about to retire. So I hope you don't mind. I'll say a few words about the man ad hominem, the man, not about what you're talking about today, because I think something needs to be said for this.
Okay, this is the story report.
So just bear with me, Michelle. All right, so now, as you know, I'm going to read a poem. Well, I'm going to read a few stanzas from a poem. This is Robert Frost's poem. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveller. Long I stood and looked down as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then I took the other, just as fair. Now you're going to tell us today, I suppose, if the road was just as fair, choosing the religious studies path. But really, I just want to say three things about Michel. We've known each other for many, 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 many years. And we've been colleagues in religious studies and colleagues in Buddhist studies. And he was my supervisor for my PhD. And it's always been a great pleasure to have Michel as my colleague and my supervisor and my friend. So it's a very, very special day for me to be officiating this event. The reason why I read Robert Frost's poem is because it speaks about choices that we make in life and the road we want to follow. And the road that Michel chose was the road less taken, the road that we've all taken, but it's not the highway. It's religious studies. We don't have great numbers of students, but not only that, he chose then to become a Buddhist scholar in Africa. So it was an important road taken. And I'm sure if Kobus was here, you'd agree that the role that you've played as not just as a religious studies scholar, but as a Buddhist studies scholar has been immense to what you've given this continent in terms of creating the field of Buddhism in Africa. And I think you are very modest in that, in what you've actually done. And I think we all recognize, and I think we all recognize the contribution that you've made to that field, that not just what immense publications you've done in all the fields, but in religious studies. At the moment, I'm doing a bibliography for Oxford on Buddhism in Africa. And literally, it's J.S. Kruger, Clasquin, J.S. Kruger. And so, it goes on and on and on, page after page of what you've contributed and created a field out of nothing, which really, really is an amazing achievement. So my first point that I want to make is that it was an important path that you chose for your life and for your career. And that I recognize, and we all recognize, that it's been a huge success. In the bibliographies, the articles that you produced bear testimony to that. And so I just want to thank you for that, taking that road, because very, very few people would have taken the road, probably nobody else. So you can carry the torch, feel proud about that. The other point I want to make is that given that choice, the road less taken, it's a difficult road. And I know that of the how many years, Eunice, of your career?
Oh, I came here in 1990.
1990. And there were times when you were, in your own words, you were clinging onto your job with your fingernails.
Yep.
And Kobus was finding a way to enable you to carry on with your research, carry on with your job. And there were many years like that. But you stuck to it, which was immense courage. And then didn't give up. So the difficulty of the road less taken, we all acknowledge. And here you sit today, at the end of it. And not the end of it. You're going to continue, I know you are. But acknowledge that, and I respect that. And I think we all do in terms of the difficulty of that road that you've taken. Always with a humor, always with a typical Clasquin-Johnson humor, tongue-in-cheek, humorous comments, like, you know. And with the UNISA changing its context all the time, you've had to move with that change, but you've stayed very true to your path all the way through. Really, the last point I want to make is a life well spent, a career well spent. That's, as I've said, bears testament to the fact that I'm doing this bibliography now on Buddhism in Africa, and it is just Clasquin-Johnson. And I remember, you know, talking many times about when you were promoted to full professor, and at the time, because you were very modest about it, and saying, well, you know, we just had to do the tickle thing, you know, for the ad hominem, then you become a full professor. But you are a full professor. You are a full professor in the fullest sense of the word, where people come to you. You are the go-to guy for Buddhism in Africa. You are the person in the world who speaks about Buddhism in Africa. So I think that I recognize that, and everybody recognizes that in this room, that you have created that space for yourself, and you are the leader in that field. So congratulations. And I'm not going to talk about what you're talking about today, but I wanted to talk to you about my respect for you and my respect for the way that you've built your career and the way you've conducted yourself in your career, and what you've achieved. So congratulations, and we will hope we'll have a good discussion, and after and I'll conduct I will manage the discussion after that. But it's over to you, sir.
Thanks, Garth. Okay, I don't intend to speak for long, because it's much more fun to just throw some ideas on the table and then watch everybody else in the room go at one another, rather than pretend to be the fount of all wisdom and, you know, the oracle of UNISA. So this is going to be a little bit autobiographical. Now, I've always said I'll never write an autobiography, because all autobiography is a lie. But just bear with me. I'm actually will try to develop a point out of this. In 1986, I registered as a fresh UNISA first-year student. The intention of majoring in science of religion, as religious studies was called at the time. I suppose it's relevant to name the two sources for that. Yeah, put this down for posterity. And the first was a science fiction novel, Robert A. Heinlein's I Will Fear No Evil, in which a character mentioned that he had once done a course in comparative religion, which is another term for religious studies. There's a couple more coming up. That struck an immediate chord with me. Wait, you can actually study this? The other source had been even some years earlier. I think you have to be over 50 to even know what the Reader's Digest was, but there was such a thing. It came in every month, and once there had been an article about this place called UNISA. And so the combination of those two led me to get my hands on the UNISA yearbook. We still had paper yearbooks in those days. Yeah. Sounds like I'm talking about the horse and carriage days, but that was 1989. Right, there was nothing under C for comparative religion, but I kept paging, and I struck gold. You could actually get a degree in science of religion from the Department of Missiology and Science of Religion from UNISA. So if you have been wondering who to blame for foisting me on the department, the university, and the world at large, you now know where to direct your class action lawsuits. Not my fault. It is the estate of Robert Heinlein and the Reader's Digest. All their fault. So in 1990, I started working at UNISA with my freshly minted BA. 2 mornings a week for 10 months. By 2000, I could add doctor before my name, and I was working full time. And now I will retire, but this is not the last you will hear of me. I have an ambitious 10-year research project lined up. And by the time I'm done, I should have doubled my current publication rate. So Garth, be prepared. In 10 years, you'll have to redo that bibliography. So if I look back over my career, what do I think about religious studies? I mean, here I've been at it since 1986, and do I have any ideas what it is? So I'm going to try to keep subjectivity out of this. I'm not going to tell you about my feelings. Let's just look at the evidence, which is my publication list. If we accept just for the moment that my career is fairly typical, we get back to that, of a religious studies scholar, then we get a very strange picture of what this discipline is. As a side benefit, it gives me the rare pleasure of committing outrageous amounts of self-citation, which normally no editor will allow you to do more than once or twice. But in the end, the purpose of this presentation is to reflect on what value, if any, religious studies has in the 21st century. So my very first academic publication, which appeared in print a month or two before I graduated, saw me comparing aspects of the psychology of Viktor Frankl with Zen koans. I thought it was a good idea at the time. And today, when I look there at my very first peer-reviewed academic publication, I'm wondering, can I still retract that? Because, it's the argumentation is very juvenile. But my other major was psychology, and that was the first and the last time that I've ever combined the two majors in an actual publication. So I have contributed to psychology. My MA thesis was a straightforward exercise in the exegesis of a Buddhist text, Singhavada Suttanta. I'm still quite proud of that. I think I did a good job. I like exegesis, taking the term broadly, not just explicating ancient text, but also finding religious meanings in modern ones. My most reprinted publication ever was a Buddhist reading of Jonathan Livingston Seagull. Now, it's actually available in 3 different places. I've done more exegesis since, and I plan to do a lot more in the future. But I'm actually not an exegete. I have very little training in the theory of text and the theory of reading texts. I haven't studied that in the English department or in the theory of literature. But here I am in religious studies. It's one of the things we do, and so you just go ahead and do it. So I went on to a doctorate, and there the focus was on history. That's another important aspect of religious studies because, yes, religious studies has yet another name, it's a bit old-fashioned now, called history of religions. Since then, I've published other works on the historical aspect of religions. And now it is the turn of my colleagues from the history department to be scandalized. I'm not a historian. I never did a single history course back in my undergraduate days. So all that historical methodology, searching archives, creating narratives, well, I just had to pick that up as I went along. I did do a few sociology courses, but never any anthropology. And still, I've done some publications that reflect on social trends and events. And then is the worst transgression of all, philosophy. My next publication will be a chapter in a book on the philosophy of humor. And my name will be listed among all the professional philosophers that contributed. And what formal training have I had in that most august and ancient of disciplines? I did second year formal logic. So, a few years ago, I published an article on a very contemporary philosophical term, metamodernism. And it turned out to be the first ever peer-reviewed article on metamodernism and religion. Nobody had done it before. I didn't actually know that when I sent it in. I knew that I hadn't found anything, but I thought, well, let's just see if anybody tells me, oh, but didn't you read Professor so-and-so's article on that? Which is what you usually get with article reviews. And then it got published, and then I started getting approached by the metamodernism crowd with this aura of awe. You published a peer-reviewed article on this, and we're just getting it started. Please come to our conferences. Well, no, I said, I've said what I have to say about it, and I've taken this, I've put it in the toolkit, and now I'm moving on. I'm doing other things. Okay, so in that article, I also committed the greatest academic sin in religious studies. I pointed out that metamodernism also had theological implications, thereby opted out of the civil war between religious studies and theology. And that's not the only time I've done that. I've got other publications where I just stepped on the toes of the theology. In recent years, I've also collaborated with my wife, Mary, here with us today, in the field of education. And there, at least I can say, I'm very modest. I only take second author because my actual training in education is non-existent. Now, why am I telling you all this? Well, there's one thing that I look at my publication record. oh yeah, this could have been sent to a sociology journal, that could have been sent to a history journal, minor rewrites. But I don't see a single publication of which I can say unequivocally, this is a religious studies publication and only a religious studies publication. Does not overlap with any other discipline. Everything I've published in a supposedly religious studies journal or book could have been published in a historical, anthropological, sociological, or at a pinch, philosophical outlet with very little modification. Could have been. Now, perhaps that's just me. That's just my unsystematic, disorganized approach to religious studies. But I don't think so. So, see, look at my colleagues here in the room. Some of them have very close ties to anthropology. Others are working very closely with the English department, colleagues there, working on text. Others are involved with gender studies. And the opposite is also true. In our congresses in the last few years, we're seeing increasing input from people in anthropology. And in the past, we've seen input come in waves from other disciplines. So that, of course, is also a specifically South African thing. Maybe elsewhere things are different. Well, 1983, I went to Washington, D.C. to attend the American Academy of Religion / Society for Biblical Literature conference. Now, cozy little affair, just me and 13,000 of my best friends. And it was held in 2 hotels in Washington, D.C. So it was a very busy street in between. And so every half hour or so, you got about 2,000 absent-minded academics trying to cross this road while in deep conversation. How there was no genocide of academics in those days, I still don't know. So anyway, there I attended a lecture by a young lady, at the time, that was 30 years ago, who was establishing herself as the world's greatest expert in the Southern Chantai school of Buddhism during the 16th and 17th centuries. That's her specialty. That is a level of specialization that we can only dream of in South Africa. As Scott mentioned, I've done a bit of work on Buddhism, and in my work on Buddhism here at UNISA, well, to put it in theological terms, this time, I've done the Old Testament of Buddhism, I've done the New Testament of Buddhism, I've done the systematic theology of Buddhism, practical theology of Buddhism, and the church history of Buddhism. Yeah, could put it in other terms as well, of course. But even back there in Washington, D.C., this very specialized person, colleague, had to write her paper in a certain way because her audience was not other Tiantai Southern Buddhist school 16th and 17th century scholars. There were other scholars of Buddhism, and there were scholars of China And there were scholars of the 16th and 17th century. So although she was able there in the USA to specialize to a much greater degree, she still had to communicate on a wider level. Now, there's also the question of history. Academia operates in certain waves. When I arrived at UNISA, religious studies was just coming out of a sociological period and entering one on deconstruction. It's amazing how little we hear that word these days. I mean, when I came here, you couldn't walk down a passage without hearing about deconstruction and postmodernism. Yeah, but these things happen in all disciplines, as far as I know. There are fashions, there are waves of influence. I think what makes us a little bit unique, we never drop these things. Yeah. We can write exegesis that would have been entirely understandable to F. Max Muller back in the 19th century. You borrow survey methods from the social sciences, analyze religious performances in a postmodern irony. We never drop a methodology. We just sort of put it away and say, you stay there until we need you again. I think that is a very important aspect of religious studies. I had a PhD student who wrote a thesis on Dumézil, a French scholar who was very popular back in the 50s and 60s. And then since then, nobody's ever heard from him again. And then my student says, but I like this old scholar, and I'm simply going to revive interest in him. And so he did. So, religious studies, by all of its previous names, was created in the early 20th century out of a complex mishmash of Sanskrit philology, anthropology, sinology, and a dozen others, loosely held together by a fairly superficial reading of Husserl's phenomenological philosophy. And it remains true to its origins. Religious studies is not really a discipline. It is a multi-interdisciplinary field. Now, I'll give you an example. When I was a sociology student back in 1987, Sociology 101, I had a prescribed book, which was written by Haralambos. And the entire thrust of that book was that there were three kinds of sociology: functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. You could get that out of the book, you're pretty much guaranteed a pass. Well, pad it out with a few details. Okay, I checked this morning. That book, well, Haralambos has died, but another author has picked it up and, reworked it a little bit, but the basic structure is still there. That book is still in print. It is still being prescribed by various sociology departments. It's still selling by the thousands. So, despite this supposed three-way civil war within sociology, it tells you that sociology is a very settled discipline. They may disagree about their three approaches, but they've agreed what it is they're studying. And that those divisions are set in concrete. It's going to be very difficult to establish the fourth way of doing sociology. Okay. So that is not what we have in religious studies. I mean, I've already indicated there are 5 names that the discipline has been known under. There are probably more. Yeah. First thing we start off our students with is a definition of religion. Well, actually, we give them 2, because there is no one definition of religion. And we warn them that if we were feeling nasty, we could give them 100. See? But here are 2 that for you to play with and see which one works better in a given situation. Could give you 10, could give you 100, easy enough. Yeah, so we don't have a single definition of religion. So we are very comfortable not agreeing on what it is we study. The sociologists will say we study society. Economists will say we study transfer of goods and services, and we disagree on how it works, but we agree what there is. Right. So we also don't agree on how it should be studied because we keep gathering in methodologies. So we have to ask, is it a discipline? And that's an important question because in what my old friend Dani Goosen called the Humboldt University, the university as we know it today, if you can claim to have a discipline, then you have a department to teach that discipline. Not entirely sure that the reasoning behind that sort of 18th, 19th century reasoning still holds. Religious studies is basically a bunch of people who are all interested in related phenomena, which we will call religion because we have to call it something. So let's step away from research and consider what we teach. We teach the different religions, but that doesn't mean that necessarily that we advance the acceptance of religions diversity. Now, we could just as easily say we teach different religions so that we can figure out why ours is the best. Yeah. No, I'm not saying that there's people who do that. Theology of religions. Right, but yeah, so just the fact that we teach Buddhism, Hinduism, etc., does not mean that we advance diversity, acceptance of diversity. But when you add to that the fact that we all merely use our own methodologies, then you start to see what does this do to the student? Right? What does this mean to know that there are different religions, there are different ways to study these religions. There are different conclusions you will come to. So when we expose the student to that range of diversities, then I think you start to get a different kind of student. A student with an agile mind, a willingness to acknowledge that there are different ways to look at human existence, all of which are arbitrary, subject to revision. So to be a religious student, a religious study student, means constantly retraining yourself. And if the ways we look at religions are all relative, the religions themselves become relativized. Now that may sound like the worst thing that could happen, but let me show you that that's not necessarily true. Ananda Kumaraswamy once remarked, the more we learn about Buddhism and Hinduism, the harder it is to tell the difference. And I think in religious studies, that you can see that happening with all these traditions that we're studying. Right, so I have now insulted sociology, anthropology, philosophy, psychology, and did I miss anyone? Okay, but I have not yet trod on the toes of Islamic studies. So let's take an example from there. So when I came here, and I already had my undergraduate degree, if you'd asked me what happened in Arabia, 7th century, I would have said there was polytheism, on which there, by the way, there is very little documentation. Then the Prophet Muhammad came, and since then there's been Islam. Now that's a very simplistic way to look at it, I know, but that was the impression that I got from my undergraduate studies. Since then, I have read more, talked to people, and surprise, surprise, by the 6th century, not only were there Jewish tribes living in Arabia, it was also a hotbed of monophysite Christianity, especially in Yemen. Some of the oldest Arabic writings are Christian from that area. And that gives me a whole different perspective on the Prophet Muhammad. And it does not diminish him in my view. No, it tells me that he was a man who was aware of all the intellectual and religious currents in which he lived, right? And yeah, so he was not an empty vessel into which divine knowledge was poured. Then he could have been anybody. Divinity could have chosen somebody else, 100 years earlier, 100 years later. But when you see the total context in which he lived, the historical context, the social context, then you see that Islam had to start there in Arabia. And it actually, you start to see that only this man could have done it. Now, because the normal pattern is you get this deeply spiritual person who starts a religion. A couple of 100 years later, you get this political figure who says, right, and now everybody accept this. Jesus / Paul and Constantine, the Buddha and Ashoka, right? That's the pattern. And you can see the Prophet Muhammad had to do all that by himself. And once you start reading those different aspects of it, you start to develop a real appreciation for what he achieved. So, knowing that there was already monotheism in Arabia does not diminish him. It actually shows you what kind of a man he was and what he actually achieved, which was absolutely momentous. And so, religious studies has a contribution to make to society. A successful religious studies graduate will understand there's not just one way to truth, not to religious truth, and not to truths about religion. There's no one definition of religion. There's no one approach to studying religion. Life is not simple. Reality is complex, multifaceted, and always open to reinterpretation. So it denies this pull that we all feel towards simplification, right? We're always trying to find a simple answer, and religious studies says, okay, but have you looked at it this way? So religious studies gives us citizens who are able, hopefully, to reinvent themselves and their society. Now, I am not going to comment on whether that is true in other humanities subjects. You know, there's famously, there's a historian called Woods who said that history is the queen of the humanities. Now, religious studies is definitely not the queen of the humanities. Religious studies is a soldier of fortune who will drag other disciplines into a dark alley and go through their pockets for new methodologies. And so, you know, can we make the same claims about other humanities disciplines? Well, if you can, then people from those disciplines will have to do it. Now, my concern is, one, is it a discipline? And if it is not, then are we happy to say that, no, it's not a discipline, right? Which has organizational consequences. Because this rigid structure of one discipline, one department, is something that does need to be looked at. I know there are places where there is no physical religious studies department. But there's a guy in sociology who does sociology of religion. There's a guy in philosophy who does philosophy of religion. And they create a virtual department, right? While staying in their jobs. And that virtual department presents courses, has major subjects, all the nice things. They just exist on paper, though. So that is something that religious studies will have to look at as a possibility in the future. Continuing to live as a separate department, obviously that's the nicest option. That's the one we would all prefer, because you have an office next to your buddies, but it's an old 18th, 19th century approach to the university. And so once we start acknowledging that this is not necessarily a discipline in that old fixed understanding, we can start thinking about other ways to keep the study of religion alive, whatever it is called, however it needs to be organized. So I am happy that I've spent the last 30, nearly 40 years of my life studying religion. And I think I started off by saying I don't want to talk too much, and yeah, I was lying. Okay.
Well, I can see the reasoning of your argument, but it would be great if we didn't get gatherings like this. We had to all evolve into departments. But while at last, let's have a seminar discussion about your paper. Any questions? Start us going.
Michel, thank you very much. I think you have highlighted the importance of conceptualizing religious studies as a field, an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary field, instead of a sui generis discipline. So I fully agree with you that you also mentioned the old names of comparative religious studies and history of religions, which I think remain important strategies in the study of religion. But I would like to hear you more on the critical assessments of religions that you have done work on in terms of gender, race, class, and also in religion education, the use of human rights, how religions should be taught, how they should be dealt with by the state. I know you have done work on that as well.
Well, but in religious studies, you're always going to find, the arch phenomenologists who will tell you, no, our job is just to sit back and describe what we see. And then there are those who will say that does not go far enough. You have, Marx once said, the philosophers have only described the world, but the point is to change it. I don't think anybody in religious studies goes quite that far, because we want to describe it before we, so at least we know what needs to be changed. So, yeah, I try not to put these two against each other. I know in our introduction to this, we describe it as two separate streams because you have to simplify a little bit for first-year students. But I think even if you are trying just to describe something, the act of putting that knowledge forward into the world is already saying this is something that people should take note of, right? So you can't really say that we are just objectively looking at what's out there. You're choosing to look at something rather than something else. That choice already implies that there's a question of selection, of critique going on. Yeah? It's at a pretty low level. And so I don't think anybody ever gets away from either the observation or the critique. But it's a question of being honest with yourself. On what basis are you critiquing? Are you critiquing on a conservative basis, on a progressive basis, on a radical basis? Others always compare this to going through customs. You go through nothing to declare, or do you go to the other queue and say, I have something to declare? And of course, everybody who has actually traveled knows that you go through nothing to declare, and there's no bottle of scotch in a cupboard in my suitcase, right? But no, in academic work, we have to declare where we're coming from, what our biases are. We all have them. I have them. And once you've gotten through that, you can be more explicit. You can start saying, but from a gender perspective, what is going on here? Okay, that's yet another discipline that we're poaching from, because we haven't all done gender studies, but you know, as I said, we are supposed to have agile minds. We're supposed to pick up methodologies. I don't think that really answers your question, but yes,
The religion
by choosing to study religion, you are suggesting that it's something important. And, you know, or even if you're studying atheism, the rejection of religion, you're saying that is important. And then once you start saying something is important, you are already saying, why is it important? Why is it more important than other things? So you're starting on the road to that critical assessment. It's only a start. See? Yeah.
The religion education is the one I mentioned,
Uh-huh.
which is fundamental, the shift, you know, from the apartheid way of dealing with religions in school and how it was taught as part of missiology when you joined here. To one, we said we would not propagate a specific religious tradition, and we would give equal, appreciation, let's say, or recognition of African indigenous religions, of new religious movements that you have done so much on. So that is already a value judgment that one can then, of course, take further and problematize that they are not all equal. There are certain issues, power relations that must be exposed, foregrounded, and so on. So I specifically mentioned the religion education policy.
Okay.
Not so much.
That started out very promising. Now, I was with Kobus when we went to Kader Asmal to put the initial proposal on the table. Yeah, and over the next 3-4 years, I worked with him to. We basically wrote that policy between the two of us, right? And the problem is that in South Africa, we are really good at writing policy statements. We are the best at writing policy statements. There's nobody in the world that can touch us. When it comes to actually enforcing policy, not so much. You go to schools today, you will find that teachers are reading the same Bible stories they read 40 years ago. So you have to ask, was that the best use of our time? Now, we had an education course, which I was teaching that for the 20 years that we had it. And I did a quick calculation once, and at least 250,000 teachers in this country have at least at one stage in their life heard of the Four Noble Truths, heard of the 5 pillars of Islam, right? I mean, they have been exposed to this at least once. And if they don't choose to take the effort to transmit that to the children in the class today, well, then, at least when they do get a Muslim child in their class, they will have some idea of what to do with that. So it's one of the big regrets that we didn't really manage to transform religious education in this country. You know, it was a valiant fight, but the forces of conservatism have won that one.
A lot of work on. I mean, you're interested in science fiction as well, and you've done work on programming, I believe. And I just want to know, in terms of the future, I think quite an epic moment in terms of artificial intelligence, for example. And I mean, we were talking about, religious studies becoming incorporated into things, come dimensions of things such as sociology and so forth. But even those particular disciplines are, of course, undergoing profound changes because of this wider technosphere we're in. Your thoughts on that? I know it's a very generic question as to the future, as to where things are developing, not maybe only specifically to religion, but to the social sciences in general. How do you see how these developments impacting upon the social sciences as well as maybe religion in particular?
Let me start by saying a few years ago, I saw a list, of jobs that will be taken over by automation and how long it was expected to take. And I'm happy to tell you that the job of university professor was right at the bottom of the list. This will be the last job to be taken over by the robots.
Like papers about how jobs are being taken over by robots.
There is an entire new branch of academia that I've never really looked into. I've sort of talked to Denzel about it a bit. He's really more deeply into that. Called digital humanities. And it is the application of computing theory to the humanities in the sense of using huge databases. But it's not that new. When the Red Sea Scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls, sorry, were discovered, they were kept somewhere in France in a vault, and only a few select scholars were allowed to read them. They were secret. And they weren't published. However, they did publish an index, right? So that if you came there and you asked for permission to see, you could ask for this one tiny little piece of papyrus that you were allowed to see. Obviously, for that, you needed an index. So then somebody took this index, ran it into a database, and started saying, well, that should fit there, and he recreated the entire Dead Sea Scrolls and published it. But this happened 30 years ago. Right? That's digital humanities. Long before the term ever existed. Just did it on his little Mac there, these little square box Macs. And so he published that, and then, the owners of the scrolls were forced to actually release them. And that's why today you can actually find them on the net. And so This is not future talk. This is something that has been happening under our feet. When I came to UNISA, Thea will remember this. We had this thing called spoeg en plak. If you were making up an exam and you wanted to reuse an old question, you cut it out and you glued it onto the page. And then if you wanted to change something, you wrote it in, and then you sent it off to the examenteksters. Yeah, we had people whose entire job was to type out exam papers. That is now an extinct profession because we all type our own exams into word processors. And then we give them to Tia to format because she doesn't trust us to get it right. We don't always appreciate this because Mary's department, they have to do all that formatting themselves. And so that's just an example. Digitalization of our job has been going on. You don't even think about it. It's just the normal way. Yeah, you type out your, but that would have been black magic in 1990. My first article that I refer to, I wrote it in longhand and I paid somebody to type it out for me. Then I sent it off to the journal. Probably the last person who would still be able to say that that happened. Yeah, and so I've been looking at this ChatGPT, artificial intelligence, and look, it's impressive. But I think we will be able to figure out when students are using it and just pasting it in. After a while, you'll start to see the patterns. And there'll be a ChatGPT Turnitin program to detect AI influence. However, if you think of it as a writing prompt, you've got a bit of writer's block. ChatGPT, throw me up a few paragraphs. Okay, let's see if we can improve on that, and then you start writing like crazy. So that's the way I see it developing beneficially. Not as something's going to do the work for you. Because, look, I've only played with it for a few days. But you can see how it works. You can see that it's collating publicly available information and it looks sort of bland. There's no individual flair to it whatsoever. So it's going to improve, and one day I'm sure there will be AI students registered at UNISA. I don't think any of us will live to see it, though.
Just thought, maybe if you can see the colleagues, his questions online? Yeah, good. Questions online. Is on the end or user? Thanks to money. Something to think. I'll be doing that. Is there another question? Certainly thought that might be.
Colleagues, if there are any questions online as well, please, you're welcome.
Okay. Any questions that follow from always? Okay. Okay, so should we wrap it up, or do you want more of a time to think about your questions? You sort of developing a question in your minds.
Mine wouldn't be a question, but it was interesting to hear someone who has been around over the years, like you say, kind of tracing the development of thought and development of the discipline from the time when he started until now. It was kind of quite provoking, provoking to hear what has happened from the time he started until now. And it really was good. I think apart from the fact that religious studies struggles in a sense to stand on its own feet as a discipline, the other challenge would be that in the modern university, people study in a lot of senses to get some jobs out there, so forth. And what we do have to offer, the challenge is that when students look at it, they are constantly thinking, what am I going to get out of this? When I graduate with my qualification in religious studies, perhaps majoring in Buddhism, Hinduism, African religions, whatever they may have majored in, what will they get out of it? I'm currently at UP as a postdoctoral fellow, and I do have some teaching responsibilities. Students do ask me, they are studying theology, studying religions and so forth, but it seems like they are not clear. They are not clear what this will lead them, to. So it kind of adds to what you are saying. Discipline, no discipline, can it really stand on its own? What can students do with this once they pursue it and complete? So it was interesting to just listen to you and kind of think through these issues, process them to say that what exactly are we doing? What exactly do we offer? What can our students get from what we are offering and so forth? So yeah, that's my few thoughts from listening to you, and thanks for a very good and enlightening presentation.
Well, it's not really an answer, Elijah, but just a few days ago, I saw something on Facebook. And this person said, "No, I'm not shocked to hear that all the fine art students who study painting and so are, upper middle class, upper class, they come from money. No, that doesn't bother me. It shows you that when people don't have to worry about where the next meal coming from, they will choose art." Right? And so, and it's not even in just in South Africa. You see this very strong tendency to turn the university into a trade school. Where you go to get your degree, you get your job. Right. And of course, the big thing is STEM, science, technology, engineering, and management. So it's another little meme from Facebook. 1990, The humanities are useless, study STEM. 2000, the humanities are useless, study STEM. 2010, the humanities are useless, study STEM. 2020, why are the Nazis taking over? See? And so that is the good fight we have to fight to prevent the Nazis from taking over. You know, and that's not aimed against our colleagues who are living their best lives in the science and technology departments, you know. It doesn't come from them because, you know, they're our colleagues. You know, some of them are married to them. You know, and so it's not the humanities versus the sciences, you know, it's more a question of if they're being privileged by society, then let's analyze that in our own way. What is wrong with society to make this demand for scientific, technical education at the expense of the humanities?
I maybe make it more local. So you end by saying that we can cultivate citizens in the service of society, but it has been pressed on us that we can't just talk in general terms when we present our courses, when we cultivate these citizens. We do so from a South African location. So we face specific problems here, and our discipline should also then take that very much into account. So it's true that the world doesn't consist of South Africa only, and we want to give our students a global perspective. We want to do it in a comparative way. And you have certainly also done a lot about the context from which we speak. You can say how you have addressed that issue and what you think should be done from our location.
Oh, what have I done? You're really putting me on the spot here.
Buddhism and education in South Africa.
Yeah.
Buddhism would be an important one. Religion education. I think on prisons you did something at some stage with you. Not.
No, yes, I understand the necessity for localization, yes. No, Africanization, yes, I get it. Yeah. And I'm also seeing that become yet another tick box exercise. Right. Okay, we'll just put that in chapter 17. Right. Have you Africanized your content? Yes. Yeah. I see too much of that happening, not specifically in this department or even in this university. I see that very widely happening. Yeah. It's like BBBEE. I sort of lost track, but you know, the first two BB are supposed to stand for broad-based. Yet somehow you see the same names and faces coming up again and again, you know, being appointed in yet another holding company. So, tick box exercise. And that is happening with us in academia as well. And we are so run out of our feet. You know, we're just extinguishing fires left, right, and center. And we have very little time to actually think about what does it mean that we are an African university, that we are African academics. It's not just peppering your text with a few Zulu loanwords. That doesn't really get you anywhere. It's the actual deep thinking of what does that mean, I think still needs to be done. And yeah, it's not going to be easy, because the whole idea of a university as we know it today comes to us from medieval Europe, and then developed into the Humboldt University, the Oxbridge University, which, I mean, the gowns we wear at examination ceremony, at graduation ceremonies, those were the gowns worn by medieval clerics, and which they borrowed from Roman priests. And so that gives you what Derrida calls a hauntology. H-A-U-N-T. He takes that from Marx's "Spectre haunts Europe," right? And so he said there is a historical pool, there's cultural, historical tendency which it is very difficult to fight, right? And yeah, it's, you're going on R&D now, and so I hope that you will be able to put some time aside to sit down and say, what does it mean for me to be an academic in Africa? I haven't found an answer to that. I won't claim that I have. I'm still thinking my way through that as well. I mean, but it has to be more than just a geographic marker. But does it mean that you are thinking from an African culture? Which one? There's more than one. Yeah. Or is there a Pan-African psychic connection? I don't know. I see these words being thrown around, without necessarily a real philosophical backing behind it. And of course there are African thinkers who have thought about it. Fanon, Senghor. Yeah. I'm not convinced that that is the source of the pressures we are being put under.
I'm tempted to just add to that. I think we have succeeded in substantially revising some of our modules, like the one on theory of religion. It was an intra-European debate in the past, the theories of Eberhard, of Max Müller, of Van der Leeuw, etc. And Chidester has helped us in doing that and revising that whole course to show how we can reverse the production of knowledge, not from Europe to here, but to show how knowledge was produced here, misappropriated, abstracted by colonial middlemen, and then distorted theories, evolutionary theories were created there. That's one instance of theoretical rethinking, fundamentally, theories of religion. Secondly, African case studies, like Denzel does in the material mediations of religion. Give them an example of the puja online, a game around the puja, and you ask students now design your own game where African traditional religion characters would play a role. Design a plot, etc. So then you have that comparative aspect. You learn from there and you apply it here. And there are several others that we are also using to bring back, the anthropological case studies to South Africa within a broader and comparative perspective. And then, of course, we have the philosophy of religion. We also introduce, African philosophers of religion. So I think we are making some progress, but a lot is still to be done there.
Yeah, well, I apologize. I didn't mean to belittle anyone or the efforts that we have made, and I've been involved in that myself. You have to start somewhere, and we've started with content. But what I'm saying is we have not yet decolonized our own minds. We're still in the process. We know it needs to be done. We understand why we're doing it, but it's a long road ahead.
I think we all agree that the richness of this discussion and the depth of your thinking on this subject can only come about from the long time that you've been thinking about these things and the debates you've had in your own mind, and it shows in the way that you have presented your talk today, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I think we all thoroughly enjoyed. So I want to put it to you though that you say you've got 12 years of research ahead of you. So I'm asking you that this will not be your last seminar, that you will come again and invite us and give us more of this rich thinking that you've developed.
Well, Garth, Mary also said I should tell you what I'm planning. All right. There's a section of the Buddhist scriptures called the Majjhima Nikaya. It has 152 sections. And do you know how many of those sections have ever had a single article devoted to them? 6. Vast amounts of writing there to do. So in 10 years' time, you say, oh yeah, I used to study with this Clasquin guy. And people will say, you mean the Majjhima Nikaya expert? Right? But in between, I plan to do some other things that are more controversial. At the moment, I'm looking into writing a defense of Devadatta. For those of you who don't know, Devadatta is the Buddhist equivalent of Judas. Yeah.
Did you try and kill the world?
Allegedly.
This last stanza of Robert Frost sounds so much like your voice. I thought I better read it. You can imagine Michel saying this. I shall be telling this with a sigh. Somewhere ages and ages hence, 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Thank you very much.
All right. And now I'm afraid you'll not be let out of the room until that food is gone.
Thanks.